The Ashford Tower lobby was everything money could build. Rosie Vale had nearly reached the elevator when the security guard grabbed her wheelchair and shoved her sideways. A small metal toy car fell from her pocket and rang across the marble. A second guard blocked her. The crowd said nothing. Then the maintenance door opened, and a man in a work shirt stepped out, wrench at his belt, grease on his arm, and stood between Rosie and the guards without speaking. Sarah Ashford stepped off the elevator and looked at the mechanic with open contempt. She had no idea who she was looking at. The mechanic didn't know her name, didn't know her story. He just stepped forward, and that one step was about to change everything. Where are you watching this from right now? That morning had started the way. All of Caleb Thorne's mornings started with 2 lunches, one of them marked with a drawn star, because Wren liked stars, and a long drive across Chicago to Lakeview Elementary, through streets still damp from overnight rain. Wren was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's habit of asking questions that needed real answers. At the red light on Belmont, she said, "Dad, do you have any brothers or sisters?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I had a sister. We got separated when she was little." She was quiet for a moment. She had learned which questions her father carried and which ones he answered. "Are you still looking for her?" "Yeah," he said. "I am." She nodded the way she did when she was filing something away. "I hope you find her." He dropped her at the curb, watched her backpack disappear through the school doors, and drove the rest of the way in silence. At the maintenance entrance, the guard did not look up when Caleb signed in. He never did. Caleb went to the mechanical room on the 3rd subfloor and started on the air handling units, hands moving through the routine while his eyes tracked the laminated building schematics on the wall. There was a pressure distribution flaw on the 12th floor, a mismatch between original design specs and installed hardware. The kind of error that waits years to become expensive. He recorded the sensor readings in the small notebook he always carried in his breast pocket. No one saw him do it. No one looked. Caleb Thorne was 38 and had been invisible by design for 3 years. Before that, his name had appeared in federal procurement documents, and his calculations had determined whether structures held under load. He had won a national award in infrastructure engineering and had not mentioned it to anyone in this building, because no one had asked. He had made himself invisible deliberately after his wife died and his daughter was 4, and he needed to be home at 3:15 every afternoon. Maintenance gave him that. The trade had been clear, and he had made it without regret. The only thing he had not been able to put down, in all the years since, was his sister, the search for her, the waiting for her, the small photograph of her he kept in his wallet. Rosie Vale arrived at the Ashford Tower at 9:45 for a meeting that had been pushed back an hour without explanation. She waited in the VIP lounge and did not complain about the delay. When a young attendant named Grace brought water, Rosie thanked her by name. She had read the lanyard and asked how long she had worked there. Grace seemed momentarily surprised, said 2 months, and walked away looking like someone who had received something they hadn't been expecting. Rosie had learned the world either made too much of her wheelchair or pretended it didn't exist. People who treated her like a person were worth noting. She had been carrying a small metal toy car in her jacket pocket since she was 5 years old. She had fragments from the time before Gerald Vale found her a road, an impact, a voice close to her ear saying stay still, and then the car, already in her hands in a hospital bed, the only thing she had arrived with. She was 28 now, and had never once left it behind. Sarah Ashford arrived at 10:15 in a charcoal suit, 8 people behind her, phone already open. Derek Moss met her at the glass doors with the practiced smile of a man who had learned that appearing collegial was more useful than being liked. His eyes moved briefly to Rosie's wheelchair and moved on. On the 31st floor, Sarah opened the leadership meeting with the restructuring proposal she had been developing for 6 weeks. The numbers were clean. Replacing the in-house maintenance team with a third-party vendor would reduce operating costs by 30%. Contracts were drafted. The transition could be completed within a single quarter. She presented this without ceremony. Derek Moss nodded, with the enthusiasm of someone who had quietly written the plan himself, because he had, and because the vendor he had in mind was operated by his first cousin, a fact he had not disclosed to anyone in the room. The financial arrangement between them was already mapped. All he needed was the decision. Nolan Reed, the youngest director at the table by a decade, kept his pen moving and his reservations to himself. He was good at reading rooms, and this room had made its decision before the meeting began. He wrote his concerns in the margin of his legal pad, in handwriting too small for anyone nearby to read. 2 floors below, Caleb was replacing a damper actuator in the ductwork corridor when fragments of the meeting drifted through the ventilation shaft. He heard in-house maintenance team, heard replaced, and caught enough of the surrounding language to understand what it meant for his roster. He finished the actuator, replaced the access panel, and moved to the next item on his maintenance log. His face did not change. Rosie waited in the VIP lounge as the meeting ran long. She had finished her book and was looking at the small metal car she had taken from her pocket, running her thumb along the underside the way she sometimes did without thinking. A different attendant came by and refilled her water without speaking. She thanked him. He looked startled, then smiled. She noticed that too. After the meeting, Derek walked directly to his private office and closed the door. He made a call, keeping his voice flat and his words brief. "The maintenance roster," he said. "Move on it before the weekend. Anyone who creates friction, they go first." He ended the call and opened his laptop. He had the practiced calm of someone who had done this kind of thing before and expected to do it again. Sarah stood at her office window. 4 stories below, on the service drive, a man in a navy work shirt was wheeling a cart of equipment across the pavement. She watched him for a moment, not really seeing him. Then her phone rang and she turned away. She had a capital round to close by Friday, and the board presentation was Monday, and there was no space in her schedule for the vague, unformed feeling that something in today's meeting had moved too easily. What she did not let herself think about because there was no room for it was the particular smoothness of Derek's support in that meeting. He had not pushed the vendor arrangement with the energy of someone advocating a strategy. He had guided the conversation toward a conclusion that was already set, with the ease of someone who had decided before anyone else had spoken. She had noticed this, the way you notice something in your peripheral vision, not directly, not clearly, and she had let it go. There would be time later. There was always something to return to later. Rosie had finished her meeting and was crossing the lobby when the wheel of her chair caught the raised brass edging of the VIP carpet and stopped. Garrett, the head of lobby security, appeared quickly enough to suggest he had been watching. He positioned himself beside her chair and let his voice carry. "Ma'am, this section is reserved for executive and VIP access. There's an alternate corridor on the north side." Rosie looked up. "That corridor is under maintenance. The front desk directed me this way." Garrett exhaled with visible patience. "I'm not responsible for what the front desk said. I'm responsible for this area. You'll need to find another route." He reached down, took hold of both armrests, and pulled sharp and dismissive, with more force than the situation required. Rosie pitched to the right. Her jacket pocket swung open. The small metal toy car tumbled out and struck the marble with a clear, bright sound, rolling 20 feet across the polished stone to rest near a cluster of people who all looked down at it and did not reach for it. Rosie watched it go. Her composure, worn carefully every day, had a crack in it now. A second guard blocked her path. The lobby noticed. Sarah Ashford stepped off the elevator, read the scene, hesitated one beat, and walked toward the European partners waiting near the entrance. The maintenance corridor door opened. Caleb Thorne stepped out, wrench at his belt, grease on his forearm. His eyes found the toy car first alone on the marble, then Rosie between the 2 guards, then Garrett. He set his tablet against the wall and walked to the toy car, picked it up, walked to the wheelchair, and placed himself between Rosie and the second guard. "Sir, you need to step back," the guard said. Caleb did not move. Garrett put both hands on Caleb's shoulder and pushed. Caleb shifted his weight slightly and did not move. Garrett pushed again. Caleb's boots stayed exactly where they were. The lobby went still. Caleb turned his head toward Garrett and spoke at a volume precise for the people standing close enough to see what was happening. You just shoved a wheelchair with a person sitting in it. The camera above the reception desk has been recording since you walked over. You want to keep going?" Garrett's eyes moved to the dome camera near the ceiling. Its red light steady. He recalculated. Caleb turned back to Rosie. He held the toy car out to her. She reached for it, and their fingers were briefly close. He looked at her directly. She looked back at him. He put his hand on the handle at the back of the wheelchair and walked forward. Straight through the VIP carpet, past the lounge chairs, directly toward the elevator bank. No request, no explanation. Garrett did not stop him. The whole lobby watched. Sarah Ashford, halfway across the room, had stopped mid-handshake. She watched Caleb reach the elevator, press the call button, then step aside so Rosie could enter first. She had seen thousands of people pass through this lobby. She did not know what category to put this one in, and she found, uncomfortably, that this mattered to her. In the elevator, as the doors closed, Rosie looked down at the toy car in her lap. Her thumb found the worn groove on the underside. She looked up at the man in the work shirt beside her. "You're going to get in trouble for that." "Probably. Why did you do it anyway?" Caleb watched the floor numbers rise. "Because there wasn't a good enough reason not to." The doors opened. He stepped out first, held them for her, then walked back toward the stairwell without looking back. The next afternoon, the central HVAC system on the 12th floor failed during an occupied board presentation. The temperature climbed 5 degrees in 20 minutes. The 3 engineers from the contracted maintenance firm stood at the control panel for 23 minutes and did not resolve anything. Nolan Reed, whose office was on that floor, stepped into the hallway with his laptop and a look of controlled distress. Caleb was coming down the corridor with a diagnostic bag. "Can you look at this?" Nolan said. "I know you're not on their crew, but the server room." Caleb had already stopped at the panel. He looked at it for a few seconds. Thermal sensor on the B-level return duct. Miscalibrated at installation. It's reading 8 degrees low, so the system thinks conditions are stable when they aren't. One of the contracted engineers said, with a short, flat laugh, "The maintenance tech is diagnosing a $2 million climate system." Caleb opened the small notebook from his breast pocket and showed Nolan a detailed schematic of the 12th floor system drawn in his own hand. The sensor location circled, a note written in the margins 6 days earlier. Then he went in, located the sensor, made the calibration adjustment, verified the reading against the system log, and came back out. 9 minutes total. The temperature indicators stabilized, one by one. The 3 contracted engineers did not speak. Nolan looked at the notebook page, then turned back through the previous pages. What he found there was not the record of a maintenance technician. Each page was dense with notation schematics drawn to accurate scale, pressure readings cross-referenced against manufacturer specs, load calculations that went several layers deeper than anything required for routine upkeep. Handwritten, methodical, and precise in a way that indicated someone who had been doing this kind of thinking for a very long time at a much higher level than the badge on his chest currently suggested. Nolan photographed several pages without asking. Rosie had finished a call in the hallway and turned at the sound of the panel door. She watched through the glass as Caleb worked hands deliberate. No wasted motion. The posture of someone for whom this was not a stretch, but a fraction of what he was actually capable of. She looked down at the toy car in her jacket pocket, at the groove on its underside. She looked back up at him. She was beginning to have a question she wasn't sure how to form. That evening, after dinner and bath time, Wren sat at the kitchen table with her colored pencils while Caleb had his coffee. She was drawing something she wouldn't show him yet. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Someone I've been missing for a long time," he said. Wren nodded, as though this was the answer she'd expected. She added a small figure to the corner of her drawing, someone new, arriving from the edge of the page, and kept working without asking anything more. Caleb Thorne had not always moved through the world at the level he was currently occupying. There had been a version of his life not so many years ago in which his name appeared in federal documentation and his calculations determined whether public structures held or failed under load. He had been good at it in the particular way that goes beyond competence into something closer to fluency. He thought in load paths and pressure differentials the way other people thought in sentences. He had left that world after his wife died, because his daughter was 4 and needed him present in ways that a senior engineering role did not permit. He had made the trade clearly and without self-pity, but the knowledge had not gone anywhere. It had simply been redirected into a notebook that no one asked to see, until now. The termination report bearing Caleb Thorne's name was submitted to the HR system at 2:47 in the afternoon, 2 days after the lobby incident. Derek Moss filed it under his operational authority. It cited obstruction of security personnel and interference with authorized building protocol. It recommended immediate separation without severance consideration. He had written it in under 20 minutes, which left time to make 3 other calls before the end of the business day. Sarah Ashford received it as one of 12 operational approvals bundled for her review. She signed it in a 3-minute window between calls, because it had come through Derek's desk, and Derek's desk was supposed to handle this kind of thing correctly. She did not read it word by word. She would return to this fact later, when she had more time, and she would not like what she found. Caleb found the envelope in his locker at the end of shift. He stood in the empty changing room and read the letter once, and then a second time, and then folded it in thirds and put it in his front pocket beside his notebook. He sat on the bench for about a minute, hands on his knees, not moving. Then he stood, completed the last 2 items on his maintenance log. He was not a man who left things unfinished, and returned his diagnostic equipment to the storage room. Before clearing his locker, he removed a photograph from the inside of the door, small, worn at the edges. The kind of photo that has been looked at enough times that the image has transferred, in some sense, to the person who keeps it. A little girl with brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, laughing at whoever held the camera. He looked at it the way you look at something that has been the fixed point of a compass for 23 years. He put it in his wallet. On his way out, Nolan Reed fell into step beside him in the corridor. He kept his voice low. "I know about the termination report. I also know it was filed 16 minutes after you intervened in the lobby. That's not an investigation. That's a response. That's not your problem," Caleb said. "I looked you up. C. Thorne, National Infrastructure Design Award, 2018. Lead engineer, Meridian Federal Complex." Caleb stopped walking. He turned and looked at Nolan for a long moment without confirmation, without denial, and then walked on. Rosie heard the news from Grace, who told her with the careful, half-apologetic tone of someone who feels responsible for what she is passing on. "The maintenance worker, the one who helped you in the lobby. They let him go this morning." Rosie was very still. "For what reason?" The report said obstruction of security staff. Rosie said nothing for several seconds. She was looking at the middle distance, at something that wasn't there. Then she took out her phone. Sarah had signed the termination report and gone back to her other work, and the day had continued, and she had not thought about it again. But at some point in the late afternoon, she had found herself staring at her monitor without reading it, and there had been something at the edge of her attention. Not guilt, not yet. Something less formed, a feeling that a procedure she had trusted had been used to accomplish something she had not actually approved. She pushed it aside. She had a board presentation Monday and a capital round closing by Friday. There was no time for the vague and unformed. Gerald Vale answered on the second ring. He was 68 years old, and the sound of Rosie's voice, even when it was level, told him what kind of call this was before she had said 3 words. "Dad," she said, "I need you to do something." "Tell me," he said. She told him. She spoke for 4 minutes without stopping, and when she finished, Gerald Vale was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "All right." That was all he said, because it was all that needed to be said, and because the next conversation he had was with his attorney. Caleb walked out of the Ashford Tower's main entrance at 4:54 in the afternoon. The October air had sharpened since morning, and the low sun turned the building's glass face amber. He stopped at the top of the entrance steps and looked back through the lobby doors for a moment. The marble, the flower arrangement, the VIP lounge with its carefully arranged chairs, and then he walked down to the sidewalk. "Caleb." He turned. Rosie was there on the pavement, her breath making small shapes in the cold air. She had moved fast. "You lost your job because of me," she said. "I lost my job because I made a choice. Those aren't the same thing." She held his gaze. "Can I ask you something?" She reached into her jacket and brought out the small metal car. She held it between them, not offering it, not withdrawing it. There's something carved into the bottom. It's been there as long as I can remember. She turned it over in the thin afternoon light. Caleb looked at the car. He had been carrying a version of this image in his memory for more than 2 decades, a toy car, slightly too large for a small child's fist, bought at a hardware store in Evanston for $4 and change. He had scratched the letters himself on the afternoon of his sister's 5th birthday, crouching on their shared bedroom floor with his pocket knife while she napped. He had been 15. He had wanted to give her something that was only for the 2 of them, something that said exactly what it said, without anyone else needing to know it. C+R, in the particular crooked handwriting of a 15-year-old who was trying to be careful. He had not been able to pretend, since the moment he picked this car up off the marble floor, that it was not the same car. C is for Caleb, he said. The words came out quieter than he intended. R is for Rosie. I put those there. The day she turned 5. Rosie's hand tightened slowly around the car. Your sister, she said. Her name was Rosie. The street noise, buses, voices, a delivery truck braking at the corner compressed and pulled away. The 2 of them stood in it like they had stepped into a different kind of space. Caleb lowered himself to one knee until he was at eye level with her. He did not speak. He just looked at her, the shape of her face, the line of her jaw, the way she held herself still over, something that was very much not still at all. He had imagined this moment in the careful, rationed way you allow yourself to imagine things you don't fully trust yourself to want. He had not imagined it on a sidewalk in October with the cars going by. He had searched for 23 years, first with his feet, then with investigators, then in the quieter way that is less like searching and more like staying ready. He had not expected that what would find him, in the end, was a toy car rolling across a marble lobby floor. Sarah Ashford, who had come back to her office for a file she had left behind, stood at the second-floor window and looked down at the plaza below. The man from the lobby was kneeling on the sidewalk in front of the woman in the wheelchair. Both of them were completely still. She did not understand what she was watching. She stayed at the glass longer than she had expected to, and when she finally moved away, she carried the image with her down the corridor without knowing exactly why. They sat outside, as the cold settled in Rosie in her chair, Caleb on the plaza bench, and she told him what she remembered, which was not much. A road, an impact sound, a voice very close saying, "Stay still, stay still." Then a hospital room with a window too high to see out of, and Gerald, who had pulled a chair close to her bed and stayed for 3 hours without being asked, who would come back the next morning and every morning for a week. He always told me there was someone, she said, a brother. He tried to find him. He didn't have enough to go on. Caleb had been listening without moving. When she finished, he reached into his wallet and held out the photograph, the little girl with the brown hair and the gap-toothed smile, laughing at whoever had been behind the camera. Rosie looked at it. Her hand was not steady when she reached for it. "That's the only one I kept," he said. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she took out her phone. She opened her photos and scrolled back to an image she had uploaded years ago, a scan of a physical photograph that Gerald had found in her hospital belongings when she was 6. Faded, overexposed at one edge, a child in a striped shirt, holding a toy car, up toward the camera with both hands. She held her phone screen beside the photograph in Caleb's hand. The same child, the same car, the same outstretched arms. Caleb looked from the phone to the photograph to the car in Rosie's lap, and back again. He did not speak. His eyes, which had been steady and measured for the entire 3 days she had known him, went red at the edges, and he turned his face briefly toward the street, toward nothing in particular, and was quiet for longer than felt comfortable, and then he was quiet, a little longer still. He had not let himself want this in a fully formed way in a very long time. Wanting it too clearly, for too long, without resolution, was a particular kind of damage he had learned to manage by keeping the want at arm's length. He had stayed available. He had kept the photograph. He had not stopped looking, and now the thing that had found him was a lobby floor, and a toy car, and a woman who had been carrying his half of a joined name for 23 years, without knowing what it meant. Inside the tower, In the executive suite on the 31st floor, Derek Moss was at his desk when his assistant opened the door and entered without knocking, which she did only when the news was not the kind that could wait. Vale Capital has reached out to the acquisitions team. Derek leaned back in his chair. Gerald Vale. He's been interested in the Phoenix development. Schedule a call. It isn't about a project. She paused. They submitted a formal acquisition offer for the company. Derek sat forward. All of it, she said. Sarah was pulled from a legal review within the hour. By the time she reached the executive conference room, the offer documents had been printed. She read through the first 4 pages and set them down flat on the table. Fair valuation, standard due diligence window, nothing irregular on its face, which was exactly what made it impossible to account for. Gerald Vale had no prior relationship with her company, had made no prior approach, and had submitted a full acquisition offer with no stated motive and no advance signal. Who initiated this on their end? She asked. No one in the room could tell her. In the corridor outside the conference room, Nolan Reed stood at the glass wall and looked down at the plaza below, where Caleb and Rosie were still sitting together in the cold. He looked at them. He looked at the conference room. He looked back down at the 2 people on the bench. He was beginning to understand the shape of what was happening, and it was considerably larger than it had appeared 4 days ago. Sarah convened a full leadership meeting 2 days later. She had spent 48 hours trying to determine why Gerald Vale, a man with no prior relationship with her company, had placed a formal acquisition offer with no preceding contact and no stated rationale. She intended to find out in this room. Derek Moss arrived first and took his usual chair and recommended an immediate legal counter-response. Vale had no operational foothold, he said. The offer could be challenged on procedural grounds. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be standing exactly here. Then the conference room doors opened. Gerald Vale entered, unhurried, with his attorney beside him and Rosie behind him in her chair. The room went quiet, in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something substantial is about to happen, and everyone can feel it, but no one has named it yet. Gerald sat across from Sarah. He did not open his briefcase. He set his hands flat on the table. I'm not here to negotiate terms, he said. I'm here to answer the question you've been trying to answer for 2 days. Sarah looked at him steadily. Go ahead. 3 days ago, my daughter was physically pushed by 2 of your security personnel in this building's lobby. She had done nothing wrong. A maintenance employee stepped in on her behalf. Within 24 hours, that employee was terminated. He did not look away from her. I want to understand who made that call, and why, and whether the person who made it had the authority you believe they had. Sarah looked at Derek. It was a look of perhaps 2 seconds level, without heat, but Derek felt the full weight of it. He leaned forward. The termination followed standard protocol. The employee in question interfered with. How many items in that termination report are fabricated? Every head in the room turned toward the door. Nolan Reed was standing there with a manila folder. He walked to the table, set it in front of Sarah, and took a position to the side without speaking. Inside the folder were 3 documents. First, a time-stamped internal system log showing the termination report had been created at 2:47 in the afternoon. Second, email correspondence between Derek Moss and a facilities management company operated by his first cousin, discussing compensation contingent on the vendor contract being awarded. Third, a summary log of the lobby camera footage, which Nolan had formally requested that morning and received before Derek had been aware a request was in process. Sarah looked at the timestamp on the termination report. She looked at it for several seconds without speaking. This report was filed at 2:47 in the afternoon, Nolan said. Caleb Thorne intervened in the lobby at 2:31. 16 minutes passed between the incident and a formal misconduct report being filed against him. He let that sit for a moment. 16 minutes is not enough time to conduct any kind of review. It is enough time to retaliate. No one in the room spoke. Derek opened his mouth. Sarah raised one hand, palm flat, without looking at him. That was sufficient. She held Derek in her gaze for a long moment, long enough that the room understood she was not offering a way out. And then she turned to her general counsel. Suspend all personnel actions filed through Derek's office in the last 30 days. Open an independent internal review. not through his team. She looked back at Derek. "You're on administrative leave effective this moment. Derek's foce, ventpole." Rosie, who had said nothing since entering the room, watched Sarah from across the table. She had come in expecting a certain kind of executive response, smooth, institutional, the kind that protects structure at the expense of the specific. What she saw instead was someone who had been deceived by a person she trusted, who understood this clearly and in real time, and who made the correct decision immediately in a room full of people evaluating whether she would. Rosie revised her estimate of Sarah Ashford upward, quietly and without comment. After the meeting, the building's attorneys took Derek Moss to a side conference room for what they called a preliminary conversation. Garrett was placed on administrative suspension pending review of the camera footage. The vendor contract Derek had been advancing was frozen. Nolan Reed walked back to his own office and sat down and looked at his ceiling for about 30 seconds, which was as close to relief as he typically allowed himself. Sarah walked down 3 flights of stairs rather than taking the elevator, because she needed the physical movement, and because she was not done processing the last hour. She pushed through the lobby door and stepped out into the cold. Caleb was sitting on the stone bench near the plaza edge. He had turned in his building access badge 2 days ago. There was no reason for him to be here, and yet here he was, notebook open on his knee, looking at the street the way people look at things when they are not really seeing them. Sarah stood in front of him. He looked up. "The report that was filed against you was manufactured," she said. "I signed it without reading it carefully, and that was a failure of my own process. I'm telling you directly." He looked at her, said nothing. "I'd like to offer your position back." "No," he said. She had not expected that. "Why not?" "Because I don't want to do that work anymore." He looked at her steadily. "I want to do the work I was actually trained for." She studied him. C. Thorne, National Infrastructure Design Award, 2018. Lead engineer, Meridian Federal Complex. "I had someone look you up this afternoon." He did not deny it. "My wife died that year," he said. "My daughter was 4. I needed to be home when school let out. Maintenance work gave me that. It was a trade I made deliberately." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The wind moved along the building's glass face, unhurried. "Gerald Vale's acquisition offer includes a staffing condition. He wants a director of engineering placed in this building, someone qualified to actually address the 12th floor pressure mismatch, the HVAC calibration error on 14, and the load-bearing discrepancy in the east stairwell that your predecessor's contractor signed off on without verifying in 2019. Something shifted slightly in Caleb's expression. "His daughter told him about you," Sarah said. She apparently spoke about very little else. Something moved through Caleb's face that was quieter than a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "Tell him yes to the position," he said. "The acquisition is your decision." Sarah held out her hand. He stood. They shook hands, something slightly formal about it. 2 people finding the terms of a different kind of arrangement than either had anticipated. Then she walked back into the building, and he sat back down on the bench and stayed there for a while, in the pale October light, and let the city make its ordinary noise around him. There was more than one way for a life to come back into alignment. He had not expected this one, but he recognized it, in the way you recognize something you have been waiting for without letting yourself fully know you were waiting. He had spent 3 years in a building full of problems that no one in authority understood, doing work that required a fraction of what he actually knew, staying available for a daughter and for a sister he had not yet found. He had not planned for a lobby incident to be the fulcrum. He had not planned for anything. He had simply kept his notebook, kept the photograph, kept showing up every day, and trusted that the correct arrangement would eventually present itself if he stayed ready for it. It had. It had just done so in a way he could not have constructed on purpose. 2 weeks later, Caleb sat behind a desk on the 22nd floor, with blueprints he had been reading for months, spread in front of him. Except now he had been hired to correct them. Rosie had suggested the dinner a table for 4, at a quiet Italian place in Lincoln Park. No occasion, no announcement, just the people who needed to be in the same room at the same time. Gerald had agreed without needing details. They arrived separately. Caleb came last, with Wren, who was wearing the sweater with the horse on it and carrying a drawing she had made at school specifically to give to Rosie. She had been told, in terms appropriate to her age, that her father had found someone he had been looking for. She had received this information with the gravity of a child who had always understood, in some wordless way, that her father was carrying something he had not yet put down. Gerald stood when they came in. He looked at Caleb the way you look at someone you know a great deal about, without having met. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did in the lobby." "I didn't know who she was," Caleb said. Gerald held his gaze. "I know. That's exactly why I'm thanking you." Wren took the chair next to Rosie without hesitation, with the total confidence of a child who has decided, without deliberation, that someone is worth sitting beside. She placed the drawing on the table and slid it across with both hands. A house with a blue roof, 4 figures standing out front, one of them in a wheelchair, all rendered in purple crayon, with evident and sincere effort. "I drew everyone," Wren said. "That one's you." Rosie looked at the drawing long enough that Wren began to wonder. Then Rosie set it carefully beside her water glass and looked at Wren with an expression that belonged to people who have practiced holding a great deal before letting any of it show. "It's perfect," she said. The dinner was long and unhurried. Gerald and Caleb talked about the building's engineering. Wren and Rosie talked about school and drawing. At some point, Rosie set the toy car on the table beside her glass, and Caleb set his hand close to it. Not touching, just near. Sarah came by at 8:15. She did not sit. She set a sealed envelope near Caleb's coffee cup, said simply, "No rush," and walked back out into the cold. Later, after Gerald had said goodnight, after Wren had fallen asleep in the car before they left the parking structure, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of him. He opened it and read the contract once, carefully. Director of Engineering, Ashford Capital Group. The title matched what he was. The work matched what he was for. He opened his notebook to the last sketch. 2 small figures, a car between them, the letters at the bottom. He looked at it for a moment, longer than was necessary. Then he closed the notebook, signed the contract, and turned off the kitchen light, and went to stand in the hallway outside Wren's door for a while, listening to the sound of her breathing slow, and even the breathing of someone who has no idea that anything was ever missing. In the morning, he would go back to the building and sit at the right desk and open the blueprints and begin making them right. But tonight, he just stood in the dark and let the quiet of the apartment be what it had become. Not an absence, not a waiting, but something whole.